I'm Katrina Holden from Wine Communicators of Australia. I'm here with Andrew Jefford. Hi,
Hello.
Andrew.
Hi, Katrina.
Andrew's joining us in Australia for a series of talks called Wine and Astonishment, and we're kicking off tonight here in Sydney. Andrew, I just wanted to ask you, in that presentation, I know you're going to talk about the dangers involved in familiarity for those of us who talk about wine. What do you mean by that?
Okay. Well, the first thing we all have to do is use a language about wine. And I think it's very easy to slip into a received language of wine, just to come up with the same terms over and over again, and the same ways of explaining wine and the same ways of expressing ourselves about wine. So I think that's one danger where we need to be very careful about being over familiar. Another thing is our assumptions about wine. I don't just mean the received assumptions that we get from others, but also sometimes when we think things through for ourselves, we can also, as it were, slip into personal dogma. And I think that's very important to be aware of that too. I think it's very important always to be as critical as one can, but at the same time as fair as one can. Never to be flattering. Always, when you praise, to have something to praise, but at the same time not to critically disengage for whatever reason. I think you should always keep your critical faculties turned on. So I think those are some of the things that are very important to watch.
Okay, and why is wine astonishing?
Why is wine astonishing? Well, do you want the 2-hour answer or the 4-hour answer? It's astonishing in so many different ways, but just to perhaps put my finger on 2 or 3 of them. The first is place. Wines are all about place, not wholly about place, but the most profound interest, I think, in wine is connected with place and the way that wine can express geography, if you like. And there's no other product that can do that to anything like the same extent. Some products can do it to a small extent, nothing else can do it like wine. So that's the first thing. The second is that it's a creation in which man, human beings, work hand in hand with nature. It's a complete 50-50 on that. And that again is something wonderful. When you look at other similar things, they're all slightly different. Either nature is delivering the raw material entirely without any man having any hand in crafting and shaping that, or it's all down to human creativity, and nature doesn't have the same kind of role. So I think that's very important too. And then of course wine is a product with alcohol in, therefore it has an emotional dimension, it can bring solace, and at its best actually it has almost a spiritual dimension too. Again, it's not a plain comestible in the way that, you know, tomatoes or grapefruit juice are. So all of these things make wine very, very special.
And by refreshing our thinking on wine, how can we refresh our communications about it as well?
Yeah, well, you know, as I said earlier, there are these traps that familiarity can lead us to fall into. I think if we want to express wine, talk about wine and communicate about wine in an original way, it always requires a making new. And the analogy I use for this in the speech, I'm using some philosophical backdrop here, and the particular philosopher I'm concentrating on also faced a problem of making new in his philosophical discourse. And what he arrived at was what he called poeticizing thought. If you think about poetry, poetry is always a making new. And what I'm trying to suggest that we should look for is, if you like, the poetry of wine. Now, I don't want to think about that in a very simple way. I don't mean, you know, purple prose. I don't mean something divided up into short lines which all rhyme. There's a poetry of doing and being, but it's going back to that making new, that recreating, so that everybody is coming to it fresh. And again, what I'm going to suggest in my speech is that often an experience of sudden fresh discovery lies at the root of a passion for wine, and that we should always try and reflect back to that when we communicate about it.
The role of alcohol in wine, I know you're going to also touch on that. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah,
it seems to me when I kind of look around the wine world that alcohol in some ways has become problematic in the way people drink wine and in the way we talk about wine. Some of that has come from the political sphere. Sometimes there are practical implications to that. But I think that would be very puzzling for any of the great bacchanalian writers of the past, because for them always alcohol was something, of course, very precious about wine. And personally, I'm all for embracing the alcohol in a wine, because as I said a little earlier, to me, alcohol is what humanizes wine. It's what lends it an emotional dimension and sometimes even a spiritual dimension too. So I'm all about the embrace of alcohol in wine, and also I would also encourage everybody to welcome a diversity of alcohol levels in wine. There's quite a lot of pushing, I think, to have lower levels of alcohol in wine the whole time, and honestly, to me that would be a wrong way to go, because if we're all trying to discover what terroir has to offer, different terroirs will always offer you different levels of alcohol in wine.
Sure.
That is part of the diversity of wine, so I think we should embrace that too, the full spectrum of different alcohol levels in wine.
Now, I know for Decanter, you recently wrote an article called Princes, Princesses and Paupers about the misconception about wine writers, earning a fortune. I wanted to ask you, why did you write that, and who were you targeting when you wrote that? Yeah,
well, why did I want to write it? I mean, it's something I think you'll agree every wine writer thinks about on a fairly regular basis. So let's say it's always present in our thoughts. But also there's been quite a lot of discussion recently about, about mega fees for this and that and whatever, and it's, certain notable wine writers have been in the frame for that, and it's caused retirements, and it's caused people to withdraw from the Institute of Masters of Wine and all sorts of other stuff. So there's lots of interest in that at the moment. So it was topical. I have to write on topical things, and I'm always very happy to offer my own personal experience there. So I was wanting to do that, but also I wasn't just writing. It wasn't just a writer writing for writers. I also think readers are genuinely interested in how wine writers earn a living and to what extent they can be objective, and so it was also to address some of that in an honest and open way. And my conclusion for anybody who hasn't read the article is that in truth, it's very hard for any writer to be 100% objective. I think it's almost a chimera or an illusion, but that's not to say that necessarily means that the whole activity isn't worthwhile. I still think that inspiration actually has nothing to do with money, and regardless of the circumstances under which you come to do a piece of work, you can still make that work of high quality, and that work can be inspired in some way or another.
Do you think some of the problems wine writers face today are new problems, or have they been around in one form or another for many generations?
Well, I think they're perhaps new problems to the extent that within, well, our lifetimes, I mean, I'm about 3 times as old as you are, but within, the recent couple of decades, wine writing has become professional in a way that it didn't used to be. When I first got into wine writing in the late 1980s, there was still a lot of wine writers who sort of did a bit of that and a bit of something else and a bit of something else, or who'd semi-retired, or it was a congenial sort of way to pass a bit of spare time. I think nowadays it's a much more professional activity, so it's important that these questions are asked.
Just finally, I'd like you to complete this sentence. Australian wine, its greatest asset?
Right, well, for me, the greatest asset of Australian wine is I would say, its terroir diversity. It's the biggest, most diverse Southern Hemisphere location. So that's what personally interests me the most.
And its greatest challenge?
Its greatest challenge is, in the broadest sense, to get more naturalness into the wines.
Thank you for talking to us, Andrew.
My pleasure.